After watching a few recent videos here on YouTube, between Ninjon's Mad Max Orcs and Miniac's layering video, I've been itching to paint up an Orc. The Games Workshop models that I have lying around don't quite capture the amount of character that I wanted for this project. So, instead, I took to my mini factory to see what I could find. PuppetsWar have an awesome range of orcs, inspired by a ton of different pop culture icons, including this epic Cyb Orc Biker. But it won't be the Cyb Orc himself I'll be painting up today. Instead, we'll be taking a look at the Ghazboy sidekick, who is full of character and I reckon is a great choice for this project. So let's grab his files, slice them up, and see just how well this Orc Biker can print on an FDM printer. It's been a while since I've touched on using resin to FDM here on the channel. This is a process that I created within Blender to bulk up resin pre-supports, like those provided with this model, to allow us to use them in FDM printing. A process which I have streamlined down into a simple to use tool. For today's model, I brought in all of my parts at once, and spaced them out before running them through the resin to FDM tool, to bulk up the supports by a value of 0.07. This thickens up the support structure for more stable FDM printing, and increases the size of the support tips, so that they can actually still connect to the model and be printed using a 0.2mm nozzle on FDM machines. If you'd like to see my full breakdown for exactly what this tool does, as well as how to download and install it absolutely for free, I'll leave the link to the full tutorial up in the card and down in the description below. Be sure to check it out. Once I had my pieces all processed, I dragged my model and supports into Orca Slicer, making sure to import them as a single model before then separating them back out. I then went through and altered my settings on the support object. For the main miniature, I'm using my usual 0.08mm profile, so for the supports we'll increase the layer height to 0.16, their walls to 2, infill to 0, and all of their speeds to 50, to speed up the overall print time and not sink a ton of extra time into making these supports as detailed as the miniature. Other than that, I just made sure that FDM supports were disabled, and added a brim, to make sure that these awkward support bases stayed stuck to the FDM print bed. And just like that, in the matter of a few minutes, he was off to the printer. Overall, these parts printed up pretty damn good. Aside from the Orc's left hand, which might have needed some slightly thicker supports or a few added towers, as the flimsy support structure wasn't ideal for FDM printing. But rather than reprinting this entire piece of the model and wasting a bunch of time, I jumped over to Blender, separated this part of his hand, and reprinted it with some simple tree supports. When it comes to support removal with these resin-style supports, it's always an absolute treat. You really are just able to push them away from the model, not even really needing to be delicate on a miniature of this size. But I will be a little bit careful, just around the areas like the cables and the straps, as to not tear off the smaller details. With the supports removed, we can see that some of the overhangs haven't printed perfectly cleanly, and we can still see a few of the nubs left behind where the supports had connected to the miniature. So here I'll just use my hobby knife to nick off those support connections, and then continuing with that knife to carve away any unsightly overhangs and scrape those areas down to make a much cleaner and smoother surface. And here I'm especially keeping an eye out for any support nubs on connection points that we'll have to glue later, otherwise we'll get gaps in the model once we put it together. Assembly goes as usual, using some stock standard superglue to hold our mini together. For our bung left hand, I'll use some cheap hobby nippers to cut away at the same location as we did digitally, and then I'll start by gluing our fixed piece into his torso, and then fitting up the connection into place with a good drop of glue. But, I hear you ask, where is our Orc Biker's base? Today we'll be printing up one of my very own FDM-friendly bases, from the Painted for Combat June Patreon release, the Rocky Roads, but more on that shortly. For now we'll bring in the 75mm bases from the pack, and choose the one that fits best. Today I'll go with the straight roadside, simply sending this straight over to the printer. This base printed up great, with its flat top layers making for an awesome smooth finish even from an FDM machine. But neither our base nor our model are quite ready for paint. First, we need to get them primed. I have outlined my full process for brush-on priming FDM minis in a previous video, which I'll be sure to leave up here. But let's go ahead and take a look at this process in action. Using Army Painter Air Primer, I brush on a first thin layer over the whole model, making sure to work this thin paint into all the nooks and crannies, but not worrying too much about getting a solid black layer. Then, once that's dry, I come in with a second layer of the same primer, but mixed with some black paint, to create a slightly thicker, more pigmented coat that I then scrub across the whole mini, making sure to get a nice black undercoat and full coverage. The thicker layer serves a few purposes. Firstly, it helps to fill in any egregious layer lines, but also serves to give me a more satin finish to paint on rather than the chalky texture of matte primer, and it creates a black base coat that I can work up from. Today we'll be going for a classic green skin orc with a black top and blue denim jeans. And now that I'm seeing his bike all primed up, it's really reminding me of the old Lego bikes that have a very similar design, and I just remember those being a very vibrant orange, so I think we'll go with that same colour here today, which should complement the green nicely. But before we get to painting, if you are enjoying this video, please do consider subscribing down below. It helps the channel out a ton and makes sure that you'll see more of my stuff in the future. And if you want to help the channel further, or just get your hands on the files for the aforementioned FDM friendly bases, why not go and check out the Painted for Combat Patreon. For a couple of bucks, you'll get access to the Painted for Combat Discord server and all of my printer profiles. And at the higher tiers, you'll get access to some awesome FDM ready STLs. The welcome bundle comes with the painting handles I use in almost every miniatures video, along with some other goodies, but you'll also get access to this month's release of FDM friendly bases. The Rocky Roads. Inspired by many a vehicle miniature, these bases are perfect for any cracked desert road, war-torn highway, or any high-octane miniatures. All designed to print support-free on FDM printers, and sculpted with flat top surfaces to minimize the amount of visible layer lines on the final print. Okay, let's get some paint on this mini, and we'll start with base coating some of the big blocks of colour across this model. As always, I'll be thinning down these paints and doing a couple of thin layers until the colour is at full opacity. We'll start with a dark green for the skin, using Angel Green, before moving on to an orange-red for the body of the bike, using Resplendent Red, which I find kind of sits between a red and an orange, working pretty well here. Once again, going over with a few layers to get full coverage. I'll then come through with a dark gunmetal metallic, and pick out all of the details on the frame that I want to be metal. And with these parts, I'm not worrying so much about full coverage, almost using the metal more like a midtone or highlight, just hitting the raised areas and obvious details, letting some of that black stay in the recesses to help define the shapes. Then I'll go ahead and pick out the pants with Imperial Blue. And yes, there is a few other details, like the leather straps and the hair that will eventually be another colour, but these details are small enough that I can pick them out as I go. So, for now, we can move on to the much more fun part of picking out some midtones and highlights. We'll start with the midtone for our orange areas of the bike, with some lava orange, and brightening up all of those orange details. And now we can move on to the part that I've most been looking forward to, the skin. Taking inspiration from the aforementioned Miniac video, I'll be going for a layered skin tone, moving all the way from our dark Angel Green, through to a midtone of green skin, and highlighting all the way up to a near neon with Rainforest Green, to give a punchy, striking visual. This started by imagining a light source hitting the model from above, making sure to cover about 80% of the skin with this midtone, making sure to increase that coverage more near the top, closer to the light source, and leaving some of the undersides a bit darker with our initial base coat still visible, to sell that light direction. I'm not going for super smooth blends here, but I will mix a little of our green skin midtone into the Rainforest Green for the next highlight, using that to cover about 60% of our midtones, focusing these highlights near the top, making sure to pick out the muscles and define all of the areas around the miniature, picking out the eyebrows, fingers, muscles, and mouth. And now, even with just these 3 layers of quite purposefully placed highlights, the skin is looking awesome and way better than a lot of my previous paint jobs that took significantly longer to finish. With that said, I did decide to come back in with a very thin glaze of pure Rainforest Green, just to pick out some of the brightest points, bumping that contrast a little further to help draw more attention to the skin. Moving my attention back to the oranges, I made a 50-50 mix of lava orange and demonic yellow, and used this to edge highlight the bike, and blended some of this mix into the exposed areas to brighten them up, making sure to not only edge highlight the panels, but also some of the more subtle details, to help further sell some of the scratches and weathering sculpted into this model. Next up, I took a moment to touch on some of the smaller details, looking specifically to the leathers that I had at some point base coated using oak brown. I now go through and add some small midtones of fur brown to the centre of the straps and to the edges of the wood, and then I come back in with my highlight using buffed hide. For the straps, this means an edge highlight around the entire piece, before adding a scratchy highlight through the midtone brown. And for the wood, I painted an even thinner edge highlight before adding some lines of wood grain to the handle. The pants got a generous midtone of ultramarine blue, covering most of the large surfaces that would be catching light, followed up by a scratchy highlight of wolf grey, to give them the look of worn, faded denim. And I'm actually really happy with how these pants came out. I'll definitely be remembering this combo of colours and techniques for the future. Next up, the hair, which was previously base coated with desert yellow, and now gets a highlight with ancient stone, to pick out the sculpted strands for a dirty blonde look. I went for blonde because I want to have a dusty sandstone base later, and having a little bit of a lighter dusty colour at the top of the miniature will just help tie the two together later on. That and the fact that a blonde orc is just kind of funny to me, because it's not necessarily what you'd expect. After that, all of the reds got a base coat of Mephiston red, followed by a small highlight using resplendent red. And with that, the only details left are a few highlights on the blacks. Using deep grey, I went for some blocky highlights on the tyres and other details of the bike, as well as some edge highlighting on the treads and boots, and after all those were done, they just left me with his black top, which, even though this isn't necessarily a sleeved jacket, I still wanted to go for a leather-like highlight. For this, I used that same deep grey to cover about 50% of the black undercoat with some chunkier highlights, and then blended it in around the edges with a glaze of black. After that first highlight of deep grey across all of the blacks on the model, I then came in with a final highlight of ash grey, to bump up all of the black highlights around the miniature. Making sure to spend some extra care when adding some textured highlights to the shirt, letting this real jump in brightness imply that black leather-like material. And now it's time to get some paint on the base, which I'll try and run through nice and quickly. I went for a base coat of desert yellow for the sandstone underneath the tarmac, and left the tarmac itself black. Then I went for a sponging of highlights on the road, deep grey followed by ash grey to give a worn and weathered look to the tarmac. After that, a dark tone wash over all of the blacks and greys to darken them down a touch, and then some of our existing yellow-orange mix for the road markings, before coming back in with ash grey and dry brushing the edges of the road itself. And finally, to brighten up the base and add some of that dusty weathering, I thinned down some ice yellow to a near wash consistency, generously applying this across all of our yellow and making sure to get it into the cracks on the road, like powdered sandstone has made its way into the weathered areas. And then even sponging some of this mix around the edges of the road. I then repeated the same step on the tyres and lower parts of the bike itself. Almost like some of this dust has been caught between the treads and all up along the bottom of our orc's bike as he's been blitzing along this dusty road. As this super thin paint dries, it will leave a dusty matte look in the recesses, similar almost to a weathering powder. And after some final touch-ups, another black wash over the base, a dry brush of black on the tyres to help redefine the treads, and even a few orky decals placed on the bike, like his rider has slapped a few stickers onto his ride, we can glue our biker down, naturally crossing over the centre line like he absolutely has somewhere to be, and then with a lick of black around the base rim, our Ghazboy Orc Biker is ready for a final reveal. Despite our minor issue with the supports during printing, this model came out looking great. And I know there will always be people hating on FDM printed miniatures, but considering how little work I had to do to get this model's supports to work well enough to have a pretty clean print, and how good it looks after very little cleanup and a lick of paint. I don't think anyone would think twice if you had an army of models on the table that all looked this good. In terms of painting this model today, I was super focused on the skin tones, following that tutorial-esque video by Miniac that I've mentioned a few times, and even though I didn't perfectly follow that guide, I am super happy with how this came out, especially when you compare this paint job to the Orc quilting that you might have previously seen me print and paint on the channel. Drop a comment down below, let me know what army or models you're currently FDM printing, and what the challenges have been for you. Don't forget to check out this month's Rocky Road's FDM friendly bases over on the Patreon, like if you liked, and subscribe to stay up to date with all of my FDM printing videos surrounding the tabletop hobby, but most importantly, thank you so much for watching, and as always, have a good one.